So you've cut your flat and consistent veneers, you've built a strong and accurate form, and you're ready to glue it all up. In this video, I'm going to show you how to make the glue up controlled and predictable. From figuring out how much glue to use, how to spread it in a really controlled way, and how to take the chaos out of clamping. The first two videos were about accuracy and precision, and this one is about execution. So let's get gluing. As with any glue up, the first thing we're going to do is actually test it dry, do a dry fit. That means we're going to get our veneers, the actual veneers you're going to use, put them in the form, make sure it closes, look for any gaps, make sure that the clamping sequence works. You've got the clamps that you need right there. And again, we want this part to be dull. We want to make sure that if anything is going to go wrong, we've figured it out in the form and not on the fly when you have glue over everything. I'm speaking from experience here. Once glue is on stuff, you want to know exactly what you're going to do. You don't want any surprises. So let's get started. I've got my 17 veneers. They're 1 mil thick. They're a little bit more than 1 mil. My total thickness ends up being 20 mil of curve lam. With your veneers, try and lay them out in roughly the order that you cut them. Obviously that's not always possible, but with thin veneers this doesn't matter as much. With thicker veneers, if you're randomly flipping them all over the place, you can create inconsistencies in the curve lam, which can make spring back, etc., more unpredictable. So try and keep them in the orientation that they came out of the board. Okay, so I'm going to imagine that these are gluey. I'll have gloves on, everything will be slippery, and I have to be able to place them into the form. They go in pretty easily by hand. I can pull the female component down to the male with hand pressure. And my veneers are captive, so even if they do slip around, they can't go anywhere because of the walls on the side of the form here. A squeezy clamp, rather than a screw F-clamp, is often a great first clamp to put on curve lam because it allows you to cover a larger distance, whereas an F-clamp only gives you the distance of the thread. Depending on how much pressure you have to apply to your form, which will relate to how thick your veneers are, it's nice to have the ability to just keep on clamping over a long distance with a squeeze clamp. Ultimately, you will replace this with an F clamp. That's closed up nicely. I'll put a couple other clamps on there. Okay. This is just a dry fit, but there's no gaps between any of the veneers. Everything is closed up smoothly. There's no binding or weird things going on between the forms. It's important that we look at the forms and make sure that during clamping, one of them hasn't lifted. So if that is happening, we can clamp here and here, which is good practice. And it's also handy to have something nearby that you can tap your veneers down in case they've slid up at all. You would do this tapping before you've put a ton of clamping pressure on. Right now, nothing's going to move. But when everything's slippery, those veneers will tend to slide up into places that you don't really want them. So you need to be able to persuade them to go back down flat. I'm really happy with this dry fit, so let's move on to calculating how much glue we're going to need, how to mix it, how to spread it, how to get it all in there cleanly. Let's chat about glue. I'll be using Techniglue, which is an epoxy paste. It's a two-part product and it works well for this kind of glue up. The first thing you need to do is figure out the surface area that you are trying to cover with glue. I would put glue on one side of the join, not on both. That's just a waste. On the can, Techniglue specifies an amount of volume of glue per surface area, but I found with really well-sanded veneers, with a dense timber, I used almost half of that. Techniglue specifies a 2:1 ratio of resin to hardener by volume. But it's like clag, it's a really thick paste and it's very hard to mix a paste by volume, so I do it by weight. If you are doing it by weight, instead of a 2:1 ratio, you use a 70-30 ratio. It's slightly leaner on the resin. It's because the densities of the resin and the hardener are slightly different. You don't need to worry about why. Just know that if you're measuring it by weight, you should do 70-30 instead of a 2:1. The way to get really consistent glue lines where you're not using too much on some pieces and too little on others is a notched spreader. I made this myself. It's a piece of HDPE. It could be a little piece of timber or MDF. It has little notches, like little teeth cut in the end. They're very small. They're about 1/2 mil deep and 1 millimeter wide. Using a notched spreader gives you really consistent thickness of glue across every piece. If you use a flat scraper or a spreader, the thickness of the glue depends on how hard you press, whereas if you use a notched spreader, it's consistent across everything. So that will save you glue and get you really consistent results. When you mix up an epoxy, it produces its own heat, and the heat speeds up the process of setting. So mix it up in a little pot and then spread it out on a pallet or a piece of MDF or whatever you've got. Spreading it out lets the heat dissipate and allows you to keep the epoxy soft for longer. It gives you a longer opening time. If you have to mix quite a lot, then mix it in 2 batches so that you're not letting a whole bunch of it just go to waste. Okay, I've got my stack made. Used slightly less glue than I calculated, which is fine, but it's all really even. Here's the sandwich. Pretty slippery. No glue on the front and the back face, obviously. Making sure that I've got my front face pointing the direction that will be visible, which in my case is the convex side. That's correct, yeah. Okay, so this can now go into the form. Make sure there's no grit, sawdust, rubbish, dust in there. Slippery, slippery. Close the form up. If you need, use a soft clamp. My veneers are thin, everything's sliding really well, so I can go straight to an F clamp. I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on this, but not too much. I've just basically let the form touch the work, and I'm going to use a little block to push all the veneers down. You might need a mallet, you might not. Just a little piece of flat MDF, anything that fits in the slot will be fine. Now we can start tightening it up. The cure time for Technic glue is 8 to 12 hours, depending if you're using the fast or slow. And that is structurally cured, but potentially, depending on the thickness of veneers, etc., you could still get a little bit of relaxation or creep after that. In general, at 8 to 12 hours, I can't do 2 of these per day, so they're going to be left overnight in the form, which is perfect. If you were using a different type of glue, which we will talk about in the next video, so have a look for that. I'll be specifically comparing different glue types for curved lam. If you were using a glue that had a shorter open time and it cured faster, so that you could do multiple glue ups per day, you could also use what's called a resting form. It's far less complicated than your main form. It can just be one piece of plywood that follows that same curve, and you take the work out of your clamping form once it is cured. So in my case, that might be 8 hours, and just clamp it lightly to the resting form. That means you've freed up your clamping form to go on to the next glue up. Again, in my case, I'm doing it overnight. It doesn't really save me any time, but with a different glue, it might. Okay, this has been in the form for over 48 hours. I left it over the weekend. So that means I don't really need to worry about putting it in a resting form. Like I said before, even just overnight is probably enough with epoxy to not have to worry about a resting form. But let's take it apart and see how it looks. Ideally, what I'm hoping to see is that as I release the clamp pressure, the piece of work isn't forcing the form apart, which means we're not getting much spring back. But we did allow for a certain amount of spring back, so hopefully it'll be okay. Okay, this is the last clamp. Very slight release there. We'll see if we can get this to move. Even with the HDPE, etc., and the packing tape, it's very common for these to be a little bit stuck. And so you've just got to figure out a way to tap them apart without damaging the form. So use something soft like MDF, place it in there and either lever it apart or just give it a gentle tap with a mallet. If that doesn't work, take apart the screws on the sides. That should release some locking, and then we should be able to pry the female component off without damaging anything. Okay, so I got 3 really narrow wedges, placed them between the HDPE and the female component of the form, and just tap them in until it just popped off. So the area that ends up holding these together, even though it's HDPE on MDF, is any glue that seeps through the bottom edge. And you can see that that's got a really nice shiny surface there. That's the reflection of the HDPE that are bonded to, and that's what we just had to separate then. Okay, first piece out of the form. Some interesting things to note straight away. I have epoxy squeezing through some small cracks on the internal face. I didn't really see that those cracks were there, they were really small, but that epoxy squeeze out has strengthened that piece. On the front face, which is visible, that has not occurred, which is good because I feel like those lines will be visible. There is some obvious glue squeeze out on the top surface here. It hasn't formed a full pool, which means I think our squeeze out was really consistent. We sort of hit the nail on the head, and I can use the exact weight that I put on this first bunch to calculate how much epoxy to mix every other time so that I'm not wasting any. There's consistent glue squeeze out on the bottom edge. Again, it didn't pool, but it just formed a really nice film. Our job now is to clean this up, put another one in the form, and then I'll do all the joinery once I've made all 4. Okay, on to the second glue up. We have removed the piece of work, and I've also carefully gone through with a card scraper like this and removed any epoxy which had bonded to the HDPE. It flakes off really easily. It's not truly bonded, but you need to make sure there's no crumbs in there because that will affect the next glue up. Another good preventative step is just a really thin film, it doesn't need to be excessive, of some sort of paste wax on the HDPE. Even if you've built or especially if you've built your form without HDPE, some form of wax is going to be necessary. You don't want to have so much wax that it impregnates the timber. You just want a thin film which prevents or aids with the release of the epoxy from the HDPE as you keep doing this. Okay, on to my second glue up. I'll choose my veneers, make sure I've got a front and back, mix up the glue using the new calculations based on the amount that we actually used, and do the same process as before. I'm keeping my veneers locked up in veneer prison. They're just stuck between 2 boards with some clamps. This keeps them really flat and stops them being damaged, and they just live in here. If you leave them on the bench, they'll get curly depending on the temperature difference, etc., or any changes in moisture. So this keeps them safe and ready to use. Okay, second curve coming out of the form. And that came free. Wedges. When you get your piece out of the form, it'll be gluey. The first thing I do is give it a quick sand to get any loose stuff off that's easy to remove. The second thing I do is put the flattest side, which is usually the base because that's where all the glue is settled, on the jointer. This gives me a flat reference face and it should be parallel to one of the faces on the inside of the form. After doing a couple of passes on the jointer, to make sure that I'm looking at timber layers and not alternating layers of timber and glue, make sure you've gotten all the way through that glue layer. Then I can go to the bandsaw and remove the top glue surface, cut off any excess glue and any excess timber. When you're creating these curved pieces, you will be using veneers that are taller than your final piece. For my piece, my veneers were about 55 millimeters, but my final piece of timber only needed to be 50. So I removed about 3 millimeters on the bandsaw, and that took off some excess timber and the messy, gluey top surface where the squeeze out occurs. Now that I have a piece that's flat on the bottom from the jointer and flat-ish on the top from the bandsaw, I can use this router sled that I've created to bring the height down to the perfect 50 mil that I need. By raising the router up on these two little wooden rails, I can raise or lower the height of this flattening bit until I've taken off that top surface, gotten rid of the bandsaw surface, made it perfectly flat, and brought the measurement to exactly 50 millimeters. By sticking my curved piece down to the cast table saw surface, I have given it a flat reference surface. It is stable, it won't move, and I can use that router sled to get really consistent thickness across every single piece. From there, everything will get a final sand and we can go and square up the ends and do any joinery that we need to do. Whenever you do curved lam, the pieces that you create are always longer than you need. It's just inherent in the way that they're made. And so you've got to figure out where to cut them. Now on our form, we have some reference lines. In theory, you could use those reference lines to figure out where to cut your work. Got some here, so you can place your piece back in the form, clamp it together and apply those lines onto your piece that you've created. In practice, I found that to be not super accurate, and I'm not entirely sure why. I think it has to do with the spring back and just any inconsistencies in the thickness, once you've added glue, etc. What I found safer is to go back to your model, figure out the absolute distances between points, and then create essentially a layout jig that helps you mark those lines. I'll show you what I mean. This is my curved component. Because it's a right angle, I have really easy reference points. I've got this long flat edge here, and I know the distance from this long flat edge to this apex here is 200 millimeters. I also know that where this terminates to the end that I want to cut is 423. So I can create a big flat board out of MDF and apply those measurements to it and use that as my marking guide to lay out where I need to cut these pieces. I have a big straight edge here, which is clamped on. I know that this is square. I've marked 200 millimeters and I've marked 423. So when I place my piece along this flat edge using this flat reference, and then I bring this edge up so it's flush, I have these lines here which tell me exactly where I need to mark and cut this work. Perhaps someone could explain to me why I can't just transfer my lines directly from my form, but in my experience, it just is not the most accurate way to do it.